You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, a Star Trek The Next Generation podcast hosted by myself, Jay Reckward, and my father, Jake Reckward. We know that everyone is let me start again. We're recording this for the benefit of my son, Ben, but we know there's so many great Star Trek fans out there that we're putting all of these shows out for free on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm hanging in there, Jay.
Amen.
Yes.
Well, let's see if we can hang through this episode because
Sure.
despite, me being happy to see you again and us being together here to talk about this wonderful show, we are reviewing Star Trek The Next Generation Season 3, Episode 22, The Most Toys, which debuted on May 7th, 1990 with an in-world star date of 738. Is that correct?
It should be 438.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, 43872.2.
Right.
In the year 2366.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think this is a brilliant episode, especially late in the season. It's a really great episode for Brett Spiner. The main villain, Kevin Faja, is played by Saul Rubinek, who turns in a really wonderful performance as a villain.
He does.
Saul Rubinek is also known for playing Donnie Douglas on Frasier and Artie Nelson in the sci-fi series Warehouse 13. So he has a really long and laudable career, but Brett Spiner really does put in some really great acting in this episode. But at the core of Most Toys, I think we're going to be talking tonight a lot of the questions like, we're going to act... This is a hard way to phrase this. We're going to talk about dignity versus justice. We're going to talk about vengeance versus justified defense. And we're going to talk about... Well, we're going to talk about Data's humanity, but we're going to talk about Data's humanity in a way that I don't think we've ever approached it before. Because in many cases, the show, when we touch upon Data, tries to present Data in a positive light. And this episode is interesting because in many ways, it takes Data and places him in a morally ambiguous, almost gray role. Where on one hand, he's justified in his actions, but if we ask ourselves deeper questions behind his motivation and behind the possibilities of what Data can do, I think we're going to discover some very interesting things to talk about. But before we begin, do you have any thoughts on the Most Toys and just your general view of the episode?
I think it's an interesting episode because some of the questions that you put forth, I think they were right on target. I think the other thing it just talks about, looking at my notes, it's about uncontrolled greed and selfishness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And Fajo represents that, and that's what ends up challenging Data, because Fajo is so cruel to Data.
Mm-hmm.
And when we get to the end of the the sort of ambivalent, or the decision, the ambivalence in Data's actions before Fajo is arrested, and then his final words with Fajo, it's really interesting what happens there.
Well, this episode really does deal solely with the dark side of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And while it does present some rays of light to it, I don't think that there isn't a morally uplifting ending to this.
No.
If anything, I think when we always talk about Data, as we've said before, we're always kind of acknowledging the fact that he's already human despite being artificial. Um, and if anything, we're just watching him evolve into a more complete human being, whatever that is.
Well put,
Um,
yes.
but I think here we're going to start having episodes where we're going to discuss through Data the darker progression, I think, of human identity. And in many ways, the episode is built around ideas of possession, um, theft, violence, coercion, intimidation, but ultimately, kind of how do we deal with the idea of preserving human dignity in a world where is in many cases undignified,
Mm-hmm.
and humanity in itself is an undignified creature in many cases. Tonight I think we're going to have a very deeply psychological discussion about all these things. So to dig into the episode real quick, the USS Enterprise is picking up hytritium to decontaminate a water supply that has been poisoned by tricyanite. Tricyanite? Tricyanate?
Yes,
Anyway,
tricyanate is what they call it. Yeah.
on the Federation colony Beta Agni 2, and they are buying it from a trader named Kivas Fajo, who is apparently a specialized trader that deals in potentially volatile chemicals and materials. This material, hytritium, is so volatile that it can actually not be moved safely with the transporters. So Lieutenant Commander Data has been sent via shuttle to transport the hytritium between the Enterprise and Kivas Fajo's vessel. During the final exchange, Fajo executes a ruse by destroying the shuttle that Data's on, so he can add data to his collection/museum of unique items, which are there for his personal satisfaction and egotistical aggrandizement, since he shows it off to his friends. Um, that is really kind of the basis of the episode here, and of course the kind of follow-up mystery, both to recover Data, which is kind of led by Geordie LaForge and Wesley Crusher, which we'll get into a little bit because there's some interesting technical
Right.
aspects that they discuss. But
One
getting
comment
into the
one comment I'd like to
yes,
make before we
absolutely.
started the podcast. I was watching on television that movie, a couple years old, The Monuments Men, which is based on a true
Right.
story. These American art experts that went in to
Mm-hmm.
recover art that the Nazis stole. And
Mm-hmm.
we're talking about Fajo wanting to have this collection of unique items. One of the things it showed in the movie was Hermann Goering going through these
Mm-hmm.
art museums in Western Europe and just picking out what he wanted. And it's just I mean, it's like, oh, there's Kivas Fajo, but it's 1944.
Well, since we're here, let's get into it. I think we watch Star Trek often with characters that are not necessarily permutations of gray, but they're often working for interests that seem pretty benign. Um, Klingons are always working for the Empire. People in the Federation are working for the Federation. Romulans are working for Romulans. But there's this kind of general sense of duty, and people at times are willing to put aside their territorial or their ties to whatever galactic organization they're part of and choose to do moral and right things. We've seen like Romulans, turn away from battle with the Enterprise because They look like it's not worth it to you, and it's not worth it to us.
Hmm.
We've seen Klingons spare humans. Kivas Fajo is interesting because for the first time in TNG, we're seeing a character, to my knowledge, and I can't remember, besides Artemis on, I think it's Vega something,
Mm-hmm.
but Artemis, who was the creature that killed
Tasha
Tasha
Yar.
Yar
Right.
at the end of season one. Besides Artemis, I don't think that we have seen such a blatantly evil character before in the show like Kivas Fajo. And in many ways, I think that is because that mimics real life. I don't think that the world is full of Kivas Fajos. I actually think that the people like Kivas Fajos, or you mentioned one Nazi. There's, I think the unique thing about the Nazis, especially in World War II and preceding, you really did have not just like one or two truly evil individuals, but you really had like five or six of the most evil individuals in history kind of coming together to put their evil brain power to work in the worst ways possible. Um, you made the point of can you mention that figure from German history again who was walking through the
Herman Goering or Goring.
Gehring,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Villains story, and it doesn't matter if it's in actual narratives or throughout history. The people who are evil usually are deep materialists, where they collect things, they plunder, they loot. Like it was, you talk about Goering for a second, but like Hitler was a huge collector of art as well.
Yes.
So
Well,
was
yeah.
Stalin, and Mao was different. Mao actually got rid of everything and tried to burn everything, but Stalin was a huge collector of art. If you go throughout history, you're going to see a lot of people that I think we would all conclusively unanimously decide are villains. And you will see these people living these very kind of um, conspicuous consumption lifestyles that feature the collection of things that are so far out of the ordinary that they not only require great wealth, but they often require almost illegal means to get them. Um, you know, I have a friend here in my neighborhood here in New York, who only smokes Cuban cigars. Well, like it's hard to get Cuban cigars here in the U.S. still, especially since I think Trump reinserted the
Yeah, he
embargo.
did. Yeah.
Um, but is what this guy doing, getting Cuban cigars, different from anything that Fajo does, procuring things on a black market? Um, you know, I would say yes because the guy down the street who's smoking the Cuban is clearly not kidnapping people or enslaving them or um, coercing them into violence or the kidnapping of other living beings. But the line that some people will go to get what they want is very blurry sometimes until it's not. And I think when you have a character like Kivas Fajo, you finally have a character or an individual who is clearly across that line, where there's no blur for the rest of us. He's just that evil.
Well,
And I think that's a very unique thing.
yeah, I agree with that because you said that, the only other villain of this type, of this level, was Armus, who, the creature that killed Tasha Yard.
Mm-hmm.
And as I recall, he was ostracized by his race, by his
Right.
species. So he had a great deal of anger and sadness because he had been isolated for so long. Um, he chose to be that way, but he was put in position that he chose to be that way. Fajo, I would say, is more evil because he could have chose a path where he could have been somewhat of an honest trader, put his
Mm-hmm.
finger on the scales here and there, but to um, be so abusive to Varia and the people that work for him,
Mm-hmm.
and again, his selfishness with the unique pieces he collected, and then the way he treated uh, Data as a sentient being. I mean, Varia, Data, everybody who worked for him were essentially slaves, and he chose to be that way.
Yes. Well, like it puts into question some of the assumptions that we've had about the Federation previously. Like, Kivas Fajo is known to be a collector of rare and unusual things. He's also well known enough to be a trader that someone could alert the Enterprise to as carrying a material that they need to solve this true humanitarian crisis happening at one of their colonies. You would think that with Starfleet's level of intelligence and just how things are known, it seems it's pretty known that Fajo had a streak of cruelty, that he is known to procure things. I mean, Vari is his assistant, but she's clearly walking around scarred by something he did. Um, you would just think that, like, with all the people that work for Fajo and the reputation that would come with some of the actions he's taken, it's surprising that no one has arrested him yet. Now, I say that, knowing that we are in 2021 and I live in a city where tons of people have illegal art collections that are featuring things that they illegally acquired from sites that they weren't supposed to be taken from, especially in places like Asia. Like, New York is rife with Asian art that was taken from India and Thailand and Cambodia, and I'm pretty sure that those things either belong in a museum or they, to quote Indiana Jones, or they actually belong back in their native lands. But it's interesting to me that even with an individual like Fajo, who is known to be, at a certain extent, a criminal, he is still allowed to operate in the Alpha Quadrant, kind of with the impunity that he does. Now, that all changes this episode, but beforehand, I think it says something interesting about that system where even in the 24th century, we haven't progressed to the point where I think Donald Trump is a lot like Kivas Fajo or Jamie Dimon from Merrill Lynch, which,
Mm-hmm.
I might get sued for saying that, but fuck Jamie Dimon. Um, caused the 2008 crisis. Or Sheldon Adelson. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I think that a lot of those people fall in the Kivas Fajo mold, especially Donald Trump. Like, if we remember, I know there's audience members who might be supporters of his, and I'm sorry if you are. Um, I'm sorry for you, but there was a statement they made that, like, he could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and get away with it. How's that different from Kivas Fajo killing Varia and thinking, like, oh, I'll just find another Varia?
Mm-hmm.
You know, that is something that is born out of a system that allows a person like that to exist. So even in the 21st century, just like here in 2021, we are dealing with, in some ways you would think someone like Kivas Faja would be a cartoonish villain from Star Trek, but here we are dealing with our own Kivas Fajos. Even in the 24th century, they are still culturally there. Like, we still have villains and hucksters. Even Data calls him a huckster at some point,
Mm-hmm.
just like Donald Trump's a huckster. Um, we are still dealing with figures and actors like that. What do you think that says about not only the show, but also maybe human nature and the expectation of what will still be there in the future to a certain extent?
It, it says a lot about human nature in that, and it gets into capitalist society, capitalist philosophy, and so forth, American
Mm.
individualism. So that if you work
Do you
hard,
think that his individualism is uniquely American, like Fajo's? Or do you?
no.
Or here's a better question, and this is outside of the show, but it's connected. Um, do you think American individualism in particular is that level of toxic?
Um, Not necessarily, because I think the drive to be successful and be above everyone else and leave everyone behind, sort of Ayn Rand fountainhead type thing. I think that
Yeah.
exists in all cultures and in all countries. And
Yes.
I mean, it gets into, I mean, one of the things I heard in the local news here, since I live in the Raleigh, Durham, North Carolina area, that someone has given enough money to Durham County, which it has a lot of wealthy people because Duke is there and so forth, but it's got, you know, ghettos and a lot of murders this past year, particularly in the African American community because of stress of the pandemic and economic stresses and so forth.
Oh
But
yeah.
somebody has given enough money that they're going to have a program for. It may end up being just 40 people, but people that have gotten out of jail, out of prison, they're going to give him a monthly income, the Andrew
Mm.
Yang plan of $500 a month, and just see what difference it makes. And
Okay.
and that's the kind of and this again, this is kind of off the the storyline, but it relates. It gets into the whole controversy of whether you wear a mask or whether you get a vaccine to SARS-CoV-2. Is it more important to exercise what you see as your individual freedom to not wear a mask, not follow a government mandate or suggestion, or not get a vaccine versus doing these things that protect yourself and is for the public good? So that's kind of like the anti greediness of looking at, and maybe that gets a little
Mm.
bit into people's concerns about socialism, that everybody's going to be equal and have the same thing and
Well,
everything.
so if I may just define that a little bit, because I was recently writing something for someone about this. Um, so when we talk about socialism versus capitalism, capitalism prides itself on the idea of the equality of opportunity. We all have the ability to go out on the marketplace and
Hmm.
somehow hang out our shingle and make money.
Hmm.
Socialism or communism, as it's sometimes correctly and incorrectly connected to, both of them stem from Marx. Um, Socialism kind of guarantees an equality of outcome. Now, both of them have their merits. So, like, I think the equality of opportunity is an obvious one. Everyone gets a chance to like go out there and make money, find fortune, build a life for themselves. That's great. The truth is, opportunity is not equal. The system is definitely weighed for certain people,
Hmm.
and this is where it gets into the equality of outcome. Um, Communism and socialism have this idea that if you just give people the bare basic minimum or enough that they live a decent, comfortable life, that somehow you will end all social strife, which is in some way what the Federation is doing, because everyone's fed, everyone's clothed, everyone's housed. No one, they said constantly, Earth is a paradise, so no one's living in poverty. Um, the belief is that if you somehow obtain for every citizen economic freedom, you will do away with all the social ills. Which is something that you mentioned the universal basic income
Hmm.
scheme that's being tried in Durham, which is built off of Andrew Yang's idea of a
Hmm.
freedom dividend that he pushed during the 2020 election. Um, I think that it does speak to the good part of human nature that not only are they trying to do this with people, but they're trying to do this with prisoners who are really starting out on less than the bare minimum.
Right.
Most of these people are coming out of incarceration with not only are they starting with nothing, they now have to live with a felony over their head, which affects their job opportunities, their ability to um, own and procure housing, so many things. So the fact that we do this is a great thing and speaks to kind of the opposite of the greed that you notice in society. I think one thing that it doesn't I think one thing that you point to that is a problem, however, and there's another thing I want to point out that happened in North Carolina that I shared recently, I think on my Instagram, at jrequired, everyone. But a teacher in North Carolina, somewhere in North Carolina school systems, raised $100,000 to pay to make sure that her students didn't go hungry. And people were talking about how the media focused on how great and heroic this teacher is, but no one's paying attention to the fact that the systemic problem had reached the point where all of these kids needed $100,000 just to make sure that they're fed. And it took a teacher by themselves doing it and not the state doing it
Mm-hmm.
already
Mm-hmm.
to fix the issue.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the problem with equality of opportunity, like I said, is that not all opportunity is equal. Not everyone starts in the same place. The equality of outcome argument fails because you know you assume that the equality of outcome is everyone's getting what they need. Well, someone is going to have to make the decision on what everyone gets and what everyone needs, and what everyone gets and what everyone needs is always going to be in constant disagreement.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, those two things don't work. And I'm bringing those up because I think when you have those two ideas at war with each other, you have people that slip in between, and they're the ones that are able to make hay or manipulate
Mm-hmm.
or find power in this situation, like Kivas Fajo.
And that this brings us back to the episode.
Yes.
Yeah.
See, like, Kivas Fajo only works in a system where people are satisfied enough with where they are in the economic ecosystem they exist in, where having someone like a Kivas Fajo is tolerable because you don't know. You don't know. Like, in this, if you thought that the dovetail we took around the episode just now was big, here's one that people I don't think consider, but I think should be considered in light of the current Ghislaine Maxwell trial going on. But Kivas Fajo is this clear villain existing in the midst of Federation, the 24th century Federation. Um, Here in 2021 and for decades, Jeffrey Epstein was a well known political player in the Democratic Party here in New York City. Despite being arrested multiple times and actually convicted of child sex crimes, even after that, he was still able to get access to people like Bill Gates, Bill Clinton, real heads of power, Prince Andrew, a member of the royal family. The only way someone like Jeffrey Epstein, just like Kivas Fajo, the only way these people exist is if you have a system that permits them to exist because there's a purpose to it. And we can see the purpose actually play out here in the episode. Despite how awful Kivas Fajo is to Varya and his two other goons, and his obvious theft of like artifacts,
Mm-hmm.
and he's actually keeping an extinct creature or a creature on the brink of extinction,
Mm-hmm.
the lap thing.
Right.
Um, but the fact that he is one of the few traders that is able to procure something for the Federation makes him of value enough that they are able to overlook his ethical and moral failings or his outright crimes as long as he is able to provide them the services that they need.
Mm-hmm.
I think the interesting thing that I've come to notice about villains is that the only reason you have villains is because you have a society and a society and a system that allows them to thrive.
Mm-hmm.
They just don't magically appear out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and I really want to get your input on this, and then we'll stop off Kivas Fajo for a bit and get into the investigation about Data's disappearance and kidnapping, and then we will come back to Fajo. But one person that I found interesting and I've been reading about, and I know we've talked about Nazis a lot tonight, folks, but uh, I read the history of the Third Reich about 6 months ago. I finished it. It's a big book, and
The the William Shire book.
yes, the William
Yes,
Shire book,
the Rise and Fall.
fantastic book.
Right. It is. Yeah.
Rise and Fall.
Right.
Difficult book to read, not from a reading perspective, but from a content perspective, because the Nazis are truly evil. But Hitler doesn't come out of nowhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the thing that people forget. Like, Hitler didn't just suddenly appear in 1936 delivering speeches and rallying crowds of hundreds of thousands in cities. He had been building to that. In many ways, Kivas Fajo has been allowed to build himself to have resources to perpetrate some pretty interesting things on a interstellar level that I think actually makes him a villain on a level 2, a Hitler or a Pol Pot or a Mao or a Stalin, but we'll get there in a second.
Mm-hmm.
So in a rather ingenious kidnapping, they are able to disable Data, take composition of his base materials, put those base materials in enough of a quantity onto the shuttle, send it out into space, and blow it up, making the crew of the Enterprise think that the Hytridium exploded
Mm-hmm.
and claimed their second officer and dear android best friend.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say, a really convincing plot. It's a very good plot for a villain to put together. The initially, I think the beauty of this episode is the real reaction that the crew gives to Data's destruction. Um, I think especially in the beginning when you see Riker's Jonathan Frakes' reaction just over Captain Picard's shoulder.
Mm-hmm.
Patrick Stewart has a great expression in that scene, but it's really Riker who kind of just sells it. Um, One thing that I like about the episode is that when they really start going through Data's things in his office, it's Wesley Crusher and Geordi who are sent to collect his final valuables. Um, I want to stop for for a moment because when we go back to Kevin Fajo, we're going to talk about his collection. But I wanted to almost talk about Data's collection for a moment and just talk about the human things about him. He, of course, has his violin from his Sherlock Holmes holodeck adventures, which he plays as a musician very well. And we'll actually see him play it in the
Mm-hmm.
next episode for Sarek.
Yes. Right.
Um, we see, of course, the Book of Shakespeare, the Captain Picard lent him, which they also used in the holodeck. The thing that I found interesting, and I think we always forget that Data has served in Starfleet for 24 years up to this point. Um, Geordi pulls out a case full of Data's medals and
Mm-hmm.
hands it to Wesley Crusher, and they're both very much in awe of it. Now,
Mm-hmm.
we never really see the medals, for a long period of time or really up close, but Wesley Crusher sits there and says, these are some of Starfleet's highest commendations.
Right.
And if you go and look at Data's Memory Alpha, he really does have the highest honors to the point of having something akin to multiple Congressional Medals of Honors. And what's the. Okay, I know the Congressional Medal of Honor. What's the one for Valor? That's
the Congressional Medal of Valor has valor on it. Yeah.
no, there's one that the Army gives. It's not. There's the Purple Heart for the wounded.
Distinguished Service Medal or something like that.
I think the Distinguished Service Medal. That's the
Mm-hmm.
one I'm thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Data essentially has all of the awards you can be awarded in Starfleet, and despite that, he is still only a lieutenant commander after 24 years. Do you find it interesting that he's not a captain yet, or not in command?
Hadn't thought
And do you
about
think
it.
that do you think that oh well, now that we're thinking about it, um, I find it interesting that he's just not in a higher position. And when you think of the fact that he's been awarded as much as a human would be awarded for a distinguished career, it just seems very odd to me that Data was in the place that he was in.
Well, when you think about it, yeah, that is a valid observation and comment. Just like Riker should probably be in command of his own ship as
Mm-hmm.
well. Um,
Right.
but I think what it is, gets back to the practical aspect of the story writing. They just wanted to keep these characters, as part of the whole story, the ongoing, 7 seasons.
I do think that the inclusion of Tasha Yar's hologram
Hmm.
is a particularly sweet moment in that scene. And I think it really nails home the idea that, like, I think everyone else in the room, especially I think Jordy and Wesley share this moment where they realize that, like, Data was in love
Hmm.
with
Yes.
Tasha Yar, or
Yeah.
had that sort. And I think that's a very interesting moment that doesn't get enough attention.
Yes.
But we get to this point where Jordy just doesn't believe that Data had an accident or pilot error, which is originally what they assumed happened with the exploding shuttle, a pilot error. So he begins to run this investigation where he notes that Data, despite being human, is still an android and is kind of this creature of like rote action. He does the same thing over and over and over again with perfection. And by finally noticing that like something was off by the way Data's the chronicle of events that Data took part in prior to the shuttle exploding seeming off,
Yes. Right.
there's this interesting scene where Riker tells a very despondent and kind of desperate Geordi that, if you want to keep investigating this, you can, but you have to go get some sleep because
Hmm. Hmm.
we have to be at Beta Agni 2 soon, and I'm going to need
Hmm.
your help with um, helping to decontaminate this poisoned water supply.
Hmm.
I asked you this earlier. I called you earlier today before we did the show to do some pre-production like we sometimes do. And as some will remember, and as you've mentioned multiple times in the past, you worked in tissue banking and cornea donation services
Hmm.
for the majority of your career, and participated a lot in the research and discussion of ocular sciences, especially in terms of the treatment of uh, eye diseases and blindness.
Hmm.
Um, there is a scene here where Geordi is asleep in bed and he has an epiphany through a dream about Data, and he wakes up, and in this moment Geordi is clearly blind. He has been blind by birth. He searches around his bed, and kind of the same way that people comically look for glasses in other TV shows, he has to turn them the right way around. He has to turn the visor the right way around and then put it on his eyes to see.
Right.
Um, I found this scene interesting, and I really wanted to explore it with you because this is being told in 1990, and I just wanted I just wanted your take on what you thought of Geordie's visor and how it's presented here, and then what was the view in 1990 of treating ocular diseases or ocular disabilities when it came to periphery technology, or just what was the view in 1990 of treating things like blindness versus what is being talked about and available now. And this is also on the back of an article that I will include in the comments below,
Mm-hmm.
um, of a recent development in the UK of the creation of a set of bionic eyes.
So to get into this, I think that what mainly area I worked in was in corneal transplantation, with the cornea being that clear front window of the eye. If that gets injured or diseased, it becomes cloudy, and obviously light cannot pass through uh, properly into the eye and focus on the retina. So corneal surgery, transplant surgery, has advanced to the point where it used to be if you had a corneal disease or injury, you'd replace the full thickness of the cornea. Now it's advanced that if just the front part of the cornea is diseased, or just the back layer, you actually replace just those layers of the cornea that are affected. And then you have other ocular diseases that, like glaucoma, which is, demonstrated, makes itself evident by an increased pressure in the eye, but it's really a neurological disease because the pressure affects the optic nerve. And you've got other inherited retinal diseases and so forth. And when you get into, retinal diseases, the retina being like the film in the camera, if the retina is not functional, or, the optic nerve is diseased in some way, so that the light energy that enters the eye cannot be translated into electrochemical energy to go through the optic nerve into the occipital cortex where vision occurs. What was started to thought about in the 90s is, well, are there ways that we can either directly provide stimulation to the occipital cortex by having some sort of visor like what Jordy has, so that would provide vision? Or can you put some sort of light sensing chip onto the eye, into the eye, on the surface of the retina, and then have that chip somehow integrate in with the neurons, the photoreceptor pathway, so that the electrochemical energy can get into the brain, so that there could be a sense of vision. So in 1990, a lot of that was being theorized, and where we are now is that there are devices that are actually put into the eye and the retina, and provides some vision, not anything like we are used to with normal vision, but people can have a pixelated sense of an object moving and so forth. I'm not really sure as to how advanced it is, but we're slowly maybe making progress towards some sort of bionic eye. And as you said, people can reference that article that showed up in The Engineer, a daily British online engineering journal. And so I think it's very interesting that in this episode in 1990, they actually probably did some research on, well, what might be possible in the future, so that they focus on how the visor was actually a very important tool or prosthetic to allow Jordy vision. And as we know, the visor, what the wavelengths of light it can see is much more extensive than what we can see. It's not just the visible spectra, so it gets into the ultraviolet, infrared, and probably the ultraviolet too.
Oh, I was recently watching an episode with Ben today. It was it's the one where they go to the planet and the entire society is genetically engineered to fulfill the roles of that society. It's season 5.
I don't remember that one. Yeah.
I think it's the Master Society, something like that.
I
But
don't remember that one. Yeah.
they're taken aback by Geordi actually being blind.
Hmm.
And at one point, someone asked him, like, "Well, what can you see with the visor?" And he says, "I can see the entire electromagnetic spectrum."
That's right. Yeah.
And I think that that's interesting because, on one hand, and thank you for elucidating as much as you did on the development of ocular technology for blindness. But one thing that I find interesting is that we still haven't figured out how exactly we see images as they are fed into the brain.
Hmm.
So even in the 24th century, Geordie's visor is not a perfect facsimile of our vision.
Hmm.
He still has, he is being fed something that we cannot see. So in many ways, the question should be: in the 21st century, have they really solved the problem still, or have they really just figured out a workaround?
Mm-hmm.
And is that really? Do you think that is probably more of the future, a workaround versus having perfect
Well,
HD vision?
I think that the visor is a workaround because then in one of the TNG movies where Geordi has bionic eyes, he's actually seems to be seeing his vision is very similar to what normal
Right,
humans are.
right, because he has that moment with sunset, with
Right,
sunset.
exactly, exactly.
Do you know what's interesting? One thing I will commend the show on when it comes to this, the show is very aware of the progress of its own technology sometimes because
Mm-hmm.
Pulaski offered Geordi the chance to
Mm-hmm.
take these bionic eyes in season two, and he turns
Right,
her down.
right.
Both as a way to, talk about how being disabled doesn't mean you're not functional, but also there was this understanding that there was still a risk to the surgery at that time. Clearly, by the time First Contact rolls around, wherever that risk is to the surgery, it's reduced to the point that Geordi feels that it's appropriate enough for him to take.
Mm-hmm.
Um, One thing I have to ask you is the future of medicine. We have really advanced prosthesis now, but I think optimally, the future would be something where, sure, you might have prosthesis, but if you could regenerate or grow a limb, or replace it with something just as organic and just as good as the original, do you think that that would be the path that we take in terms of like replacing eyes or replacing
I'm,
uh, I know that in your career you worked on a bioengineered cornea at one point.
mhm.
Where do you think that, in your estimation, where do you think things are going in terms of ocular sciences solving blindness?
Well, not just in solving blindness, but what you're talking about is really the concept of regenerative uh, medicine. Is that
Yes.
it's sort of like Coca-Cola ain't nothing like the real thing. So that if you can figure out how to, um, you know, regenerate a normal tissue or normal organ, or manufacture an organ, say for transplant, that basically mimics a natural organ, that's really the way to go. I mean, just to
Hmm.
talk about, um, corneal transplantation, most of the thickness of the cornea is collagen called the stroma, and that can
Hmm.
become diseased or cloudy, and you can do what's called a lamellar corneal transplant. And what is slowly making some progress is being made is that you can use a um, bioengineered stroma of various materials to replace that part of the cornea.
Mm.
And what happens is it's really a scaffold so that you have some
Hmm.
healthy, what are called keratocytes out near the periphery of the cornea. Those cells will migrate into the scaffold and it will chemically remodel it so that after 6 months, a year, that bioengineered material essentially becomes normal tissue. So,
So, what
it,
is the difference between that and stem cells? Because that sounds like stem cells.
Uh, Not necessarily. The keratocytes would, in a sense, be acting as stem cells, but just to some degree, yeah.
Do you think that going off this, do you think that when we talk about regenerative medicine, we are talking about a future that uses stem cells or something like that more than not?
Stem cells would be in the mix, yes.
How
Or
much do you think that they would be in the mix versus like, because I know, for example, athletes right now, instead of pursuing, traditional scalpel on a slab surgery, a lot of them like get their knees repaired using stem cells, their spines, stuff like that.
I think it's
One thing that's really big in Germany is something called Regenikine,
mm,
where they pull your blood out and then they put it in a centrifuge and they draw out the stem cells and then they
right.
re-inject your stem cells back into the area that needs to be treated, and a lot of people have seen like really tremendous recovery from it.
I think those sort of stem cells or stem cell like cells are part of the mix. The other thing is just the whole concept of you know understanding the biogenesis of tissues and organs, so that
Hmm.
there's a lot of study being done, for instance, on the genome of the zebrafish, because it's apparently very easy to study. Or why do salamanders, if they lose their tail, how can they regrow their tail? So
Right.
they're looking at things like that as to very understand all the off and on switches that turn genes on and off that might end up resulting in being able to regenerate a tissue, an organ, and so on.
I asked you this earlier, but I wanted to ask you again just for my own edification, but also for the audience's education. Um, Jordy's eyes are blind from birth. He doesn't have any discernible pupils, and he doesn't have any discernible irises.
Yeah, that's because his corneas are totally opaque.
So, in that case, what do you, and I know I asked you earlier and you were like, I can't really speculate, but if you could just indulge me for a moment, um, what do you think happens between him losing his visor and him getting the bionic um, eyes in first contact? Do you think that that is a new eye, or do you think that they were able to, I guess, regenerate the old one? And would you be able to, like, I guess, replace the cornea, replace the
Yeah, we talked about this earlier. Is that I think that what Jordy ends up with is truly some sort of bionic eye. It's a replacement for his natural eye, and
so?
it might have artificial elements, but actually living cell elements too. But
Do you
that's
think?
just totally speculation on my part.
Well, I think that it's interesting and I think it's good speculation because I think one thing that we have looked at here in the real world is the regrowing of organs, and the eye
Hmm.
is an organ, of course.
Hmm.
One thing I wonder about in the future when it comes to Jordy having surgery to get these bionic replacements, do they actually like crack open his occipital bone and like actually
Well,
put these things in, or do they grow them inside the socket and connect it from there? Um,
they probably have to remove the diseased or non-functional tissues and organ, and then actually put the bionic eye in place. They wouldn't have to remove any bones or anything like that. The whole trick is, how do you, if the bionic eye has a functional retina and it's receiving light, and it's converting that light into the electrochemical impulse.
Thank you. This is what I
the
want to know.
the
Yes.
whole key is, how do you regenerate the optic nerve or the connection with the optic nerve? That's the key thing. And
And I guess
there is some research being done on that, because some blindness is caused by atrophy of the optic nerve.
so. I have to ask you something, and this is a ballpark, out of left field question, but I've always been fascinated by the notion of vision, and you've been involved in the healing and the treatment of it all of your adult life. Um, we mentioned that Geordi sees the electromagnetic spectrum, and the real challenge is getting to see things. And later on, he's able to see a sunset as we see them. What do you think the trick is for us seeing vision as you and I see it? Like, what is happening in the brain? Do you think that there's a specific mix of that electrochemical compound that goes into the occipital cortex? Like, what do you think is the secret for us having to see the way we see versus seeing the electromagnetic spectrum?
I don't know. I'm sure there are
Okay,
neuroscientists that can do a good job in explaining what we do know, but I don't have a clue, to be honest, of how that works.
okay. See, because I don't either. And it's
Yeah,
always, when it comes to the idea of like healing blindness,
right,
I really wonder, like, okay, how do you restore the idea of them seeing color as we see it? Like,
right,
you and I see red. You and I can agree that red is red, but you and I both have different levels of vision and may see that red in a different shade. How do you teach someone who's never seen red from birth that
right.
suddenly can see red that this is not green or
Well, and
something
the other
like
thing
that?
is understood that the retina, the cones that uh, moderate color perception in different animals, they'll see colors different from us.
Hmm. I wonder if one of the issues that we will face going forward, you know, generating artificial rods and cones for vision, like if that is going to play havoc on the human color perception of the human color spectrum.
That's a good question. I don't know.
So, um, but Geordi ultimately is able to convince Captain Picard that Data that something's been going on, and this is really kind of concluded and certified when they reach Beta Agni 2, and
The
they drop
hydration.
the hytridium into the water supply, and to their surprise, the tricyanate, which is supposed to take days to disappear if it's naturally occurring,
Hmm.
suddenly vanishes, which
Hmm.
Dr. Crusher deduces means that it was artificially placed there,
Hmm.
and that this entire um, rescue mission has actually been a ruse created by Kivas Fajo to kidnap Lieutenant Commander Data.
And
I
also, yeah, right. And he could sell off the hydration and make profit off that
right,
also.
even though, well, they kind of point out how devious they is because deviously is this is because just the production of both elements to pull off this kind of con job is actually of detriment to Fajo making a profit. He does all of this to kidnap Data, but I think that we should put in perspective what he does. He poisons an entire colony's water supply to kidnap one person. Um, you know, later when Fajo is captured and he's going to be taken into the Federation, pressed on charges of murder, kidnapping, coercion, all sorts of things. I am surprised that he is not going to be tried for crimes against human dignity or humanity or whatever the interstellar equivalent is in the 24th century because this guy poisoned a planet's water supply. Like, there's a level of evil just to kidnap someone, but this guy put potentially tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, because we don't know how many people are on Beta Agni 2, but he had clearly put many lives at risk. Um, one thing that happens is that Data, with the help of um, his assistant Varia, is that they try to have an escape. And during that escape, Fajo catches Data and Varia and kills Varia using this illegal disruptor, a Veron T disruptor, that Fajo shows off in as part of his collection. Because I think there's only like 6 of them in existence, and he has 2. There is this moment where you know, Fajo is caught, and he's trying to goad Data into killing him, and he says Data won't kill him because Data, earlier on in the episode, and I actually have the quote right here. Memory Alpha is great actually for this episode because he's able to, that they just captured a lot of Data's quotes. Sorry, folks. Oh, where'd that quote go? Oh, well, essentially what Data says is that he has a respect for human life and that he will not take a life save when he's programmed to, because he's programmed to use deadly force in the defense of another life or himself. But he is not going to outright murder someone. And Faja keeps trying to goad Data into murdering him, trying to push his buttons and prove that he can break Data and make Data do what he wants. Whether Data shoots Fajo or not at the end of this episode, which is always going to be up for debate with fans, and we'll talk about it here. What is the expectation of what's going to happen to Fajo once he's taken before a Federation tribunal? He's killed people, he's kidnapped people, he's coerced, he's stolen, he's now poisoned a planet's water supply. I mean, if he isn't going into a hole for the rest of his life, how is this guy not, unless they've done away with summary execution, I mean, wouldn't he be killed? Hey, I can't hear you.
You can now, though, right?
Oh, yeah, no, there you
Okay.
go, sorry.
Okay. All right. But I think he's going to go away for the rest of his life because, as we said, he's so inherently evil.
Well, okay, so he kills Varia. He tries to break Data into being a collectible in his collection, using inhuman means of destroying Data's clothes, basically reducing him to kind of a plaything. And Data gets to the point where Fajo is um basically saying I'm going to get away with this again. Um he even has the line right here, "Murder me. Go ahead. It's all you have to do. Fire. If only you could feel rage over Varia's death. If you could only feel the need for revenge, maybe you could fire. But you're just an android. You can't feel anything, can you?
Right.
It's just another interesting intellectual puzzle for you, another of life's curiosities."
Well,
And
and
then Data says,
right.
"I cannot permit this to continue." And then right before he beams, he leans forward with a disruptor, but he's beamed away right before. But as he's being beamed up, Chief O'Brien in the transporter
Right.
room informs William Riker that someone has fired a disruptor in the Mr. Data Mr. Data's beam pattern, and that he's able to disable the firearm, which I think is an interesting thing in the future. But it's very clear that they try to leave it up in the air whether or not Data tried to kill Fajo.
Oh,
What do you?
I think that again, it gets back to Data's essential humanness and
Yes.
what happens throughout Next Generation and into the Star Trek movies and even Picard, because I just finished watching Picard again. I watched the last episode
Okay.
today. Data at one point in Picard says about Data, he is always been human, and that what he was doing is trying to understand his humanness more.
Mm-hmm.
Since he was not born a human, but he is a synth and so on. But I'm convinced that the experience, how Farjo treated Data and how Farjo had no regard for either sentient synthetic life or organic life, as the case with Varia, that Data made a very human decision. Data made a very human decision that when he said this can't go on, that he kind of overrode his programming and decided that this guy needs to go. And,
Okay, so
and then I'll let you get into this. Once Faja was arrested in the brig on the Enterprise, their final exchange even backs that up further.
I actually have the exchange right here.
Yeah,
If you
right.
so I'm going to read it real quick and then we'll dig in. So Fajo sees Data. Oh, have you come to see me repent? Your final satisfaction? Want to see me beg for mercy? You're not going to get any of that from me. I expect nothing, said Data. Our roles are reversed, said Fajo. Aren't they, Data? You're the collector now. Me, I'm in a cage. So it seems, Data replied. Don't count me out too quickly. I had you in my collection once. I can have you there again. Unlikely, sir, said Data. Your collection has been confiscated. All your stolen possessions are being returned to their rightful owners. You have lost everything you value.
Mm-hmm.
Must give you great pleasure. No, sir, it does not, Data said. I do not feel pleasure. I am only an android.
What a good human screw you statement from Data,
Well, like,
as I see it.
so this is getting back to the original premise of this episode that we were going to talk about, the dark side of humanity. Do you think murder is okay? If you are killing evil, an evil like Fajo, is what Data is doing murder or is it defense?
Um,
And can it be both?
it can be both.
And but if it is both, does that mean murder is automatically always immoral or unethical?
If
And now we're
the
getting to the really now we're getting into the
well,
weeds.
if the Stauffenberg Valkyrie plot against
Mm-hmm.
Hitler would have succeeded, that was murder, but it was also defense, and
Mm-hmm.
not dragging Germany down further into ruin.
Right. Well, like, it gets into the question of so
I'll tell you what gets
God, it's
into
so
it gets into when I went to Loyola College, now university, to Jesuit university. We were required to take a course in ethics, and we had this
right.
old Jesuit priest named Father Higgins. He wrote the textbook, and there were some interesting things, and there were some controversial things in there. But one of the things, there was one chapter that we spent on that talking about
Right.
how war can be moral,
Yes.
which
Well,
is
like that is the difficult thing because I do agree with you that war can be moral, but one example that I wanted to get into, and I'm very hesitant to dig into it because in many ways my generation has some very mixed feelings about it now, but that's because I don't think we know anyone who actually lived through it anymore. Um, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are, from a human perspective, such difficult moments in history. Because on one hand, it's easy to say, oh, you know, it was terrible for Truman to do that, and we should never use nuclear weapons. But on the other hand, his other option was the attempted invasion of Japan, which would have guaranteed not to have not only cost millions of Japanese lives in the process, but potentially millions of American lives in the process as well, because the Japanese were going to fight to the very bitter end, to the last person, because that's what their culture dictated
mm-hmm,
in many cases. And they've gone to interview Japanese survivors of the war and Japanese veterans. They were committed to that culturally, to the idea of dying to the last person.
mm-hmm,
Um, Hundreds of thousands dead in two bombings versus the potential of millions dead after millions have already died. Um, I think that is one of those things where, just like should Data kill Kevin Fajo because Kevin Fajo is clearly evil? Where do you draw the line between trying to preserve human dignity while at the same time destroying it? And I think that that is something where the question of good and evil never actually falls in comes into question, because I think we all agree that like whatever the outcome is, like it's evil.
Hmm.
Like even though Kevin Fajo has done wrong, and this is coming from Jay Requard, who is someone who has swung a sword, fired a gun, thrown a punch, swung a kick, strangled men unconscious, and has had other people strangle him unconscious. Despite, and I'm also a fan of violent combat sports. I like violent books. Me and violence have a good relationship.
Hmm.
Despite that, I am a believer in nonviolence. Be it from MLK or Gandhi. I believe in that Kingian version of nonviolence, that if you have an absolute choice, the last choice you should ever make is to take up arms against your neighbor or against an enemy. You should try everything in your power beforehand to mitigate that option. Um, and I think, Dad, you share that as well, that you
Yes,
believe
yes.
that nonviolence is, of course, important. But the reality, and even Gandhi said this at one point during his hunger strike, because they said, like, well, what if the British government starts being violent with you? And he's like, well, at that point, Dharma would dictate. In the Bhagavad Gita, even Arjuna is told at some point you have to pick up your bow.
Hmm.
Um, is Kevin Faja one of these instances where Data needs to pick up his bow and shoot down evil?
Uh, since I believe that's what Data did, I sort of agree that um, that was okay. It goes back to the discussion of the Valkyrie, if that was the proper name for the operation where Stauffenberg and hidden conspirators wanted to kill Hitler.
I think, you know what, I'm writing a book right now where the villains are very nebulous, and who's actually to blame is not very clear. And I think it gets back to what I was saying earlier, that you don't have a Kevin Fajo unless you have a society and a system that allows him. So, like, on some level, I agree with the premise that if you have someone who is so wholly evil and committed to their own selfishness and self-interest, and you mentioned Ayn Rand, um, kind of the fountainhead objectivist
Hmm.
viewpoint.
Hmm.
I think that that is a great viewpoint to label on that one, because that is, selfishness for me first somehow preserves the universe is a ludicrous notion to believe in.
Well,
Um,
the other thing you brought up is that the villain, the evil person, they don't just kind of magically appear. There's a certain um, situation, niche even that
well, they're a
appear that
confluence.
it conflict, because one of the things that when my cousin was in town, we went to the North Carolina History Museum, and it had a very small but very complete uh, exhibition of about Blackbeard and the Queen Anne's Revenge, who was a
Hmm.
pirate back in the 1600s and ravaged from Virginia down into the Caribbean. And Edward Teach or Thatch was his name, and he was finally
Edward
caught,
Teach.
was finally beheaded, and taken back to London and or wherever they put him. But thinking about that, I mean, that was a specific set of circumstances or niche confluence that allowed piracy to exist back then. Just as
Hmm.
the Salt songs, your trilogy you wrote about that, the same thing happens because that was all based upon African pirates and that sort of thing in the Gulf of Guinea and so forth. I mean, there's a
Well, may I
go ahead.
elucidate what the difference is here? I
Yeah,
think
sure.
that, so, like, the The Corsairs in my book's Assault Songs are starting from a place of automatic desperation. These are the survivors of the fall of Talivius from The Thief of Destiny, the first Monway the Panther stories that I released
Right.
from Falstaff.
Right.
But they are starting from an economically desperate place where they are wedged between the Mirror Sea, which is very unforgiving, and then all the empires of the West that previously enslaved them.
Mm-hmm.
So like they're starting from nothing. They literally either still steal or build their own triremes. The pirates, which were based off the pirates in the Gulf of Guinea, but also based off the pirates that were the privateers of the 1800s, both of those are similar in certain stances, though I would argue the privateers were much more privileged.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the pirates of Edward Teach's generation are fighting from the bottom up. The pirates from the Gulf of Guinea, they are forced into that situation because a lot of the maritime countries that they come from are full of corrupt, violent governments. So, like, they're just being swept up into violence and corruption.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the factors that you mentioned where villains can become a confluence. Where Kievan Faja is a real problem is that Kievan Faja is starting from the top. He didn't, and he worked his way to the very top of society. Like, the pirates in the Gulf of Guinea are still poor tomorrow if they make their raids or not.
Mm-hmm.
Edward Teach, whether he was beheaded or not, was most likely going to die poor.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Kievan Fajo is not going to die poor unless he's caught.
Mm-hmm.
Kievan Fajo is not going to be jailed unless someone apprehends him. Kievan Fajo is never going to be dealt with unless Data shoots him. Kievan Fajo is a very different thing. Just like I would argue, he's more and more villainous to me as history goes on. But like Napoleon was very much, I think, a privileged character that took his own self-aggrandizement and his own idea of his own self-godhood too far and perpetrated very horrible things.
Mm-hmm.
I think I think the thing about villains like Kiva's Fajos, yes, they are confluences of the society and system that they're a part of, but they're also preying on that society and system. They're working within it. It'd be one thing if these villains were like, I think there's two different villains in the world. And one of them, I would argue, is only a villain depending on the viewpoint you take. Kivas Fajo is clearly a villain, like your Adolf Hitlers, your Stalins, your Pol Pots, stuff like that. The other villain, I think, is something like a Genghis Khan, someone that just comes in and like murders your dad, rapes your mom, enslaves your kids, burns your village. But at the end of the day, you're swept up into his society, and if you survive, you end up a member of his society. It's basically conquest and assimilation.
Mm-hmm.
He's the Borg. Like the
Mm-hmm.
Borg are villains too, but
Mm-hmm.
the Borg aren't villains in the sense that they have this animus of it's not necessarily an animus of malice
Mm-hmm.
that they are working from.
Yeah.
And Genghis Khan wasn't necessarily working from an animus of malice either. He just saw I needed to order the universe, and I'm going to do it from the back of my. I'm going to do it from horseback.
Yeah. Right.
Um, Kivas Fajo is different. He's not ordering the universe. He's preying upon it, and I think that is really where I think if I have to make the argument that someone needs to get got, that's a villain. It's that kind of villain, the
Mm-hmm.
person that's just
Mm-hmm.
preying on it.
Right.
I can forgive the gangbanger that shot someone in the drive-by because he's probably not the only person in that car. He didn't probably buy that gun himself. He didn't. I can forgive people that get swept up in something, but Kivas Fajo doesn't get swept up. He
So,
made decisions.
so you mentioned Hiroshima and Nagasaki. How does that fit in?
Well, I think on one hand, like you can look at Truman as a villain in a way, because at the end of the day, someone had to make the decision about who drops those bombs and who dies. And as he would say himself, he is known to have had problems with it later on in his life because he knew what he dropped on those people. The buck stops here. I think the reason why someone like Truman isn't a villain, because Truman ultimately, in his soul, takes responsibility for what he did. He understood that, like, I dropped those bombs.
Mm-hmm.
I killed those hundreds of thousands of people in 2 days. He's like,
Mm-hmm.
that's on me. And the reason I think he's forgivable, because at least he's willing to acknowledge that he did it.
Mm-hmm.
And that, he's responsible. And he's willing to go in front of the Japanese people, as he did at one point, and say, like, I'm sorry, but, war is war. And again, this isn't the choice. Kevin Fazo isn't making the choice ever between, like, millions of people dying in horrendous battle versus two relatively surgical strategic strikes. He's just doing this to assuage his greed and find his kicks.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's another part that I don't think that we're touching on here, that we should probably end this on. There is Fajo's cruelty is in his satisfaction with what he does.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Genghis Khan got satisfaction necessarily from wiping out 10% of the population. I think that
Mm-hmm.
was just something that happened in the course of what he saw as his destiny.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Harry Truman sat there and thought, like, yeah, I'm going to kill all of these, hundreds of thousands of people because, god damn it, I just got up this morning, I want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that these things go through those men's minds necessarily. For Kievan Fajo, it's like, no, I want to kill Varia because, I want to see what it's like to kill Varia. Or I want to enslave Data and make him a prop because I want him to be a prop.
Right.
I think
Right.
it's that kind of animus to, and I think that's the primary thing. Like, you have to judge these villains on their animus
Mm-hmm.
to really discern, like, who is truly evil. Because I think true evil is disregarding of everything but the self in its cruelest intentions,
Mm-hmm.
and it's in its most base intentions. And I think when you know that you're dealing with evil, I think versus, there were people that probably worked for Genghis Khan that thought Genghis Khan was the greatest dude that they ever hung out with,
Mm-hmm.
even though he's wiping out 10% of the population and he's impregnating, half of Asia to do it.
Mm-hmm.
There's probably people who looked at Harry Truman after he made the decision to drop those bombs and went, good job, Hank. That's exactly what we needed to do.
Mm-hmm.
There were still people that had parades for him afterwards,
Mm-hmm.
after he won the war.
Mm-hmm.
So I think when it comes to the question of, like, complicity and villainy, it's so hard because, especially in 2021, and Ben, if you're listening to this, we deal now in 2021, especially with social media, pointing fingers at everyone else, trying to place blame to figure out what's going on here and now and what's causing the problem.
Mm-hmm.
When the truth is, I think that in the fantasy of Star Trek, or the science fiction of Star Trek, it's easy to point to the Kivas Fajos and say, like, that's evil. But we have Kivas Fajos around us every day who are in our government, who are in our banking structures, who are running our hospitals and health systems. We have people like that running tech. Um, the hard part is when you actually see a Kivas Fajo and you have to deal with a Kivas Fajo, just like when Germans had to see Hitler come up. You have to make a decision. You're either going to ignore it. You have to make one of three decisions. You're either going to ignore it, you're going to go along with it, or you're going to fight it. Ignoring it's easy because no one has to put any effort until it's too late.
Mm-hmm.
And usually when it's too late, like, people will choose number two because number
Mm-hmm.
two is safe.
Mm-hmm.
Number two is the safest thing in the world. Going with a dictator is honestly great. Check, serious, and I'm not just saying that, folks. Like, look at history. Picking the side of good is honestly harder than not.
Mm-hmm.
Because number three is fighting,
Mm-hmm.
and I think we are heading to the point, and this is where we will end this episode. I think that we're heading to the point where we're going to be faced with the same dilemma Data is faced with.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to have to deal with our Kievan Fajos in this world.
Right. Yeah.
And I think the interesting thing that this episode ends and revolves around is everyone's discomfort with the idea that did Data shoot him? Did Data have it in him to try to kill Kivas Faja? Like, that's what Riker and O'Brien are wondering about on the transporter pad.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the real problem, I think, also with this episode that doesn't get talked about. Like, everyone talks about the idea of shooting the villain or going and getting the bad guy. Hell, we have an entire political polity here in the United States that really believes that everyone needs to have a gun. So, like, if there's a bad guy with a gun, there's a good guy with a gun out there too.
Right.
But when you finally have a good guy with a gun and you give him a gun and he fires on the bad guy, look how uncomfortable people really get with it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's one thing to throw I've learned this the hard way. It's one thing to throw a punch in a boxing ring or a cage when everyone's agreed to be there and everyone's agreed that, oh, we're throwing punches at each other because we're all going to find this amusing. When someone shows up and it's no longer amusing and he's like, that motherfucker's evil and I'm going to shoot them dead, it's not cheering and it's not rah
Mm-mm.
rah and it's not this
Mm-mm.
kind of movie that people
Right.
think. I
Right.
think one thing that this episode nails at the end is people's discomfort with the idea of actually having to potentially kill evil that way
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because it really is uncomfortable.
Yes.
Just like Truman having to face the idea of like sending 1 million Americans to face Hirohito
Mm-hmm.
or bombing 2 cities. Like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
there's no good answer to this.
Yeah.
And I think just like Data, there's no good answer for Data in this.
Right.
Only the one that he sees as the best option.
Right.
And maybe that's the only thing that we have when we have to deal with villainy, the best option we have in front of us.
Mm-hmm.
In our cases, for the most part of human history, it's been fighting.
Mm-hmm.
I think you would hope that we would be able to talk people down, but in a world of Kievan Fajos, can you talk those people down?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Dad, I think that we've really explored this episode. Before we
Yes.
go, is there any final comments you would like to make?
Nothing else really.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining me. I think that we had a really great discussion.
Yeah.
We are
I
going
did
to be
too.
back next time for Star Trek Season 3, Episode 23, and this is going to be a special one, Sarek. So we're
Mm-hmm.
going to be dealing with a lot of lore and a lot of world building, but we'll see you next time.
Okay, Jay. Thanks a lot. Good night.
Night. Night, everyone.